I want to start by asking you to think about the reasons that you want to be a professional musician. I guess if that's your goal, if you're like me, I don't feel that I had a choice. It was what I had to do. And that's probably, as they say, a blessing and a curse. I think it's a wonderful thing to have music in your life, and I know that people who don't have it are very often envious and mystified by. And those are the people that'll say to you, I wish I could understand this piece better. But, you know, there's nothing to understanding music. The musicologists won't be happy that I said that, or the theorists, but in a way, I think that if you're sensitive to it, either you get it or you don't get it. And not that you wouldn't learn more by hearing some music again, and we hear music lots of times for very different reasons. Sometimes just because of the emotional impact it has or memories that it brings. Sometimes because, not just the way we feel, but because we like the way the sounds interact, and sometimes because we like the virtuosity that we hear. So there are lots of reasons that we do listen to music. I would say I would strongly advise you not to make music a profession unless it is the only thing you want to do, because there are lots of people for whom that is the only thing they want to do, and they will be your competition. I had another piece of advice here. I actually wrote a few notes, but not too many. Don't make music your profession if you hope to do that for fame or money. Not that you won't achieve that, but if that's your goal, you will never be famous, and there'll always be someone more famous, and there'll always be someone with more money. So if that's your goal, you're just never going to reach your goal. But if your goal is to make music, and then you're certainly going to do that, and you're going to be happy with your life. I was thinking about, since I'm about a half a century older than you, I'm 72, and I was thinking about who I knew when I was your age, and they would have been born about 1896 or something, 1894. So who did I know when I was your age that had a professional life in music? Well, my stepfather, he played in the LA Philharmonic, and he was born in Russia about 1896. That was my stepfather. But I didn't have, I guess I had a couple piano teachers, but they were more in their 40s or 50s. Right off, I should tell you that I was a really bad student. I think the only subject that I excelled in was public speaking. Certainly nothing in the sciences. And I didn't take too many music courses in my life. I went to Reed College, and they didn't have a music program. They had one music teacher, but he taught little music history classes. So, but I had one thing, and that was that I was there at this college, and everything that I wrote, I had all these young fellow students who played instruments, and they wanted to play new pieces. So I was the only composer. I had a wonderful chance there to hear. That's how I learned, by writing and having them play it. I didn't, I looked at orchestration books, so I knew what the range of a violin was, and clarinets. It took me a long time to figure out how to transpose those instruments, but I still make mistakes there. But anyway, even a half century ago, when I was your age and as I was growing up, we had phonographs, if you know what that is. record players, and we had radio. But most people heard music by making it, either by choirs or playing in bands, no matter what style they played, or they took instrumental lessons, and they just made music, and that's how they heard it. We did listen to some popular music on the radio, but that wasn't the big deal. Now the whole paradigm has changed completely. For most people, that's just no longer the case. So I've seen these really huge cultural changes in the role of music in our lives, and you will witness even more. And you can't predict what those are going to be. Within maybe, I remember I taught a class in 1968, 67 maybe, The Future of Music. It was what they called a freshman seminar. And I had 12 students, and they each had to write a paper about what they thought would be the future of music. And I can tell you, I still have that document. When I look back at it, it has no connection with reality. It just doesn't. It's hard. We were just on the verge of the computer revolution, but in those days, in that time, a computer was a very large mainframe, and very few people ever used that unless they were in the sciences or something, or learning elementary computer programming. At present, most of the paradigms that enabled musicians to earn a living are disappearing. In the parlance of media, we are no longer musicians, we are content providers. And I think that it's really the triumph of capitalism that means that media can provide music to the general population without compensating the artist. That's where we are right now. People don't get paid for their music, A few people get paid. Justin Bieber gets paid for his music. But, think of it. Not many people earn their living out of all the people that would like to, or are even good enough to. Forget who they would like to. Everybody'd like to. Sometimes when I'm on an airplane, someone says to me, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a composer. They say, oh, I wrote a song once. So that's where we stand. Now, you can always be a music teacher, but you better not be a music teacher unless you love it. And I do love it. And I've done it since I was 22. After 23, I went to a little school in Arizona called the Verde Valley School, and I conducted the choir and a little tiny orchestra and gave piano lessons and taught music history. And boy, that's how you learn. I never conducted in my life, but I did a little, and I'm left-handed, so that's always confusing. Because I was going like this, and they were not used to that, they're used to this. So I learned that just go like this. But that's a good way to learn things. Not that classes don't help you, but when you really have to learn something. Now, I never took much music, as I told you, and I did take one class in counterpoint in college, and I got into a fight with a teacher because he said that I had to follow the rules of counterpoint, species counterpoint we were writing, if you know what that is. And I said, no, I'm a composer. I'm a composer. Why do I have to follow other people's rules? I make the rules. No, he said, that's not how you learn, And I didn't understand that. And so I never really learned to do counterpoint until I had to stand up in front of a class and teach it. And then I did a quick study. And luckily, we were going through the species, so I figured out how to do whole note against whole note. And I got really good at it. I did after years of doing it. You know, I could just take a paper and smell the parallel fifths. There it is. And, you know, it got really, and I loved doing it. I loved it because the trick with counterpoint, which my teacher never told me, and he could have told me, because he said, well, listen, you know, what you should realize that the idea is to be creative within those rules. And he never said that, so I didn't know that. But I think you can be, to a degree. So let's see. Now I should talk to you about, I told you about how I was kind of self-taught. I was a very good pianist from the time, I didn't start studying music till I was 6, but once I did, I started both writing it and playing the piano. And I like to make up my own pieces. And I remember at Cherimoya Grammar School in Hollywood, California, not far from where I'm living right now, I played the Martian Concerto, which was not a piece that was written out, but it was something I improvised for the PTA. And at that time, I wanted to be a composer, but I also wanted to be a cowboy and a ballet dancer. And I did. I did, well, I wasn't ever a cowboy, you know, but we used to dress in these leather chaps and climb in the chaparral and stuff in the Hollywood Hills. And I never studied ballet, but I once did a ballet dance in that same grammar school with a 78 record called Dance of the Hours by Ponchielli. Have you ever heard of that piece, any of you? I can imagine what I must have looked like, some freak. This little 9-year-old boy dancing around with a little record player going. But, you know, I was just free. But why did I do that? Because I was very moved. My dad was playing in the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo Orchestra at the time, my stepfather, and he took me to a performance of Petrushka, and I thought, oh my God, that's what I want to do. I mean, you know, there's nothing quite still as exciting as that, and then to experience as a kid, you know, and it's amazing. So, and Stravinsky was conducting. It was in the Shrine Auditorium. And afterwards, my stepfather took me backstage and said to Stravinsky, this is my son, he wants to be a composer. Stravinsky was quite a small guy. He was about the same size as I was at that age. And he said, very nice to meet you. And that's it. That's my contact. That's the only great person I ever met. I mean, musician whose work I am still dumbfounded by. I can't imagine how he wrote The Rite of Spring or those pieces at that age, and not where those ideas come from, because that's the question they always ask you when you're a composer. They say, where did you get that idea? Well, I don't know, found it under my bed. You know, I mean, what do you say? Where did I get it? You know, but I mean, what he did at that time was so different from what had come before. Except for the orchestration, which clearly, you know, comes, if you know the early works of Stravinsky, like the Firebird, come from Rimsky-Korsakov, his teacher in St. Petersburg. Okay, so I was studying music, and then I went to I tell you these things because I'm going to better quit this Skype, because someone's going to try to call me. You could talk to Roger Lynn. Do you know who he is? He invented the Lynn drum. He just came up on Skype. He's a really good friend of mine. Well, so then, you know, I went to teach in this little school after college, and then after that I decided that I was going to go to graduate school, so it was easier to get into schools in those days. I mean, you know. And so I went to the University of California, Berkeley, but I had no, they made me take a whole bunch of theory tests. I'd never studied theory, so I failed them. So they said, well, we can't give you the fellowship anymore. So then I went to the University of Oregon, where they said, well, we haven't had a composition student here in 20 years, so you're very welcome. And I'm serious. I'm serious. And so they made me a teaching assistant for music history, because I always knew a lot about music history. And then at the same time, I learned a little theory. And so then I happened to be lucky to have started doing electronic music then. Well, in those days, that was something very unusual. There was a studio at Columbia University, and which was a joint project with Princeton, where Dr. Botello was a graduate student. And then there was one in Illinois. There was the San Francisco Tape Music Center, one in Toronto. That's about it. So here I was in Oregon, and there were only 2 records that I could get of electronic music, LPs, Stockhausen Gesang der Jünglinge, and Hank Bodding's Sonata for 2 violin and 2 loudspeakers. That's what it was called. You know that piece?
Paul showed us before. That one in Stockhausen. Is that the one you showed us the siren blast?
You might.
No. Oh, it's a different piece.
Anyway, so that was pretty much fun to hear those pieces, and my teachers were pushing me in those days. If you were a graduate student anywhere, almost anywhere in the United States, either you wrote music exactly like your teacher, or you wrote 12-tone music, and that was usually what your teacher wrote. Because in those days, people honestly believed it's called 12-tone or serial music. You all know what that is? And people thought, well, that's the only way, that's the future of music. Everybody's going to be writing that way. And I wrote it, and I thought, wow, that sounds terrible. I wrote a couple very complicated pieces. My teacher came in for the summer. His name was Henri Lazaroff. And made me write these pieces for 2 flutes. And then I had to write a thesis, an orchestra piece, a serial orchestra piece. And I wouldn't listen to that now. I don't even know if, there's a recording of it somewhere. But so luckily I found that if I connected all this equipment together, these tape recorders and stuff, and oscillators and filters, there was no equipment for electronic music. I started to make this stuff, and it sounded, I thought, pretty good, and it was very original. And so that was my ticket to the future, because I was able to do something original that was considered avant-garde, which you had to be, and then and yet at the same time it was something that I liked and that I found interesting and challenging. So I became kind of a crusader for electronic music, and that was back in 1963, and I guess I don't need to do that anymore because everybody else does that now. No, nobody knows what that is. Nobody knows what that is. Were you at Princeton that time that I talked about electronic music? No.
I think at Holmes Festival.
No, this was another time I came down with Lars Gunnar Bodin from Sweden, and so we were talking about what is electroacoustic music? What is the meaning of this? Cultural significance of this? And so I said, well, if you imagine all of music as being the ocean, and then you imagine classical music or whatever of all kinds being the waves on top, and then you imagine contemporary music, avant-garde music, that's sort of like the foam on top of the waves, and then on top of the foam are these little bubbles. That's about as important as electronic music is, or electroacoustic music. It was then. And so this grad student, I can't remember who it was, but this guy raised his hand and he said, "Did you come here to drop a turd in our punch bowl?" I thought that was pretty amazing. And I didn't mean to. I just wanted them to be a little cognizant of how important it is because, it's some of these places. You're welcome. Nice to see you. In some of these places, people have this inflated idea of the importance of what this medium is. It isn't that it's not valuable. It's just that be realistic. What are people playing it for? I mean, my dad, I told you, my stepfather, he heard my first pieces. Well, he didn't want to hear that. He didn't believe that was music. He said, drop out of music. When I got a master's, he said to me, hey, John, have you considered law school? Because he was worried, who's going to make their living writing that kind of music? Well, I made my living partly writing that kind of music, but also being a teacher, which was something I loved. So if you can do that, that's pretty good. But what if you can't do that? I don't know. That's why I said, it's tough out there, so you better just want to do music, and then you'll be fine. Because the sacrifices won't seem like sacrifices, because every day you get to do music. Okay, well, sort of, how much time have I used up? It's 2:26. So, a couple of you have heard music that I've written, but, so I don't know what you haven't heard, but I have some short pieces to play for you. I don't know which ones to play, but they're short. And I've chosen a piece, a number of years apart, 20 years apart, 15 years apart, 8 years apart, 2 years apart. No, there's just 4. So this piece that I did in 1967, which was called, it was rather something unusual for the time. It was based on a singing commercial by the Andrews Sisters for Chef Boyardee pizzas. And it was released on a 45 single. Do you know what those were? They were pop singles by a pop jazz company called Flying Dutchman. And, well, I guess some of you haven't heard that piece, so I'll play it. But I don't know how to play it because it's on your computer.
Which piece? Are you talking about the original? Or
Yeah,
the
Chef d'oeuvre.
CHEF.
C-H-E-F.
That's the first one.
From Chef Boyardee, from Chef Boyardee, yes, 1, 2, 3. Pop 'em in the oven, there's never any brother, one would rather wear the sister, one for mother. Pop 'em in the oven, there's never any brother. Chef Boyardee. 4 little pizzas from Chef Chef Boyardee. Oh, little pizzas from Chef Boyardee. Oh, little pizzas from Chef Boyardee. Oh, little pizzas from Chef.
Okay, that's it. I hope it doesn't go on.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
Thanks. So, you know, that what was unusual about that piece was that it used existing music. I mean, people throughout, composers throughout history have quoted other people, but you know, they this used existing music, and it used it for it kind of I don't know. I'm tongue-tied at the moment. It made a cultural commentary on the music, and it also distorted it in ways and that were not intended. And you know, well, that was the late '60s, so people were into alternative music at the time, and this was quite unusual. I mean, there was the tradition of musique concrète, which is where you take natural sounds and process them. But no one ever actually, the whole principle of musique concrète was not to recognize the sound, the sound sources. And here we were recognizing the sound sources and also actually making something of them. And it's a kind of music, not the only kind by any means, but certainly a kind of music of mine that is probably best known. And I've continued to do that. So let's look at 20 years later. I'm still doing the same thing. In 1987, I wrote a piece called Hommage à Milanés, which is homage to Milanés, Pablo Milanés, the Cuban singer. But it is a political piece as well as a commentary and musical commentary and sociological commentary on the music of this Cuban singer who is still to this day a great supporter of the Cuban Revolution. So why don't you play? It's called Hommage à Milanés.
O morir sin amor, o morir sin amor, o morir sin amor, o morir sin amor, comandante sin amor, comandante sin amor. ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, comandante? ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte sin amor? ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte sin amor?
Comandante, comandante, comandante.
¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, comandante? Que no sea cambiar mi guitarra por tu suerte. En vano busco con mi guitarra tu dolor. En mi jardín ya todo es bello, no hay temor. ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, en vano busco comandante, con mi guitarra tu dolor? Que no sea cambiar mi guitarra por tu suerte. En vano busco con mi guitarra, en vano busco con mi guitarra, 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 en En vano busco con mi guitarra tu dolor. En mi jardín ya todo es bello, no hay temor. ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, comandante?
Comandante, comandante, ¿qué puedo yo dejarte, comandante, comandante? ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, comandante? Que no sea cambiar mi guitarra por tu suerte, o negarle una canción al sol, o morir sin amor. ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, o morir sin amor? ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, o morir sin amor? ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte?
¿Qué puedo yo dejar? Darle una canción al sol. ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, comandante? ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte? Suerte. Darle una canción al sol. ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, comandante? Suerte,
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 suerte.
suerte. ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, comandante? ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, comandante? ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, comandante? Darle una canción al sol, darle una canción al sol. ¿Qué puedo yo dejarte, comandante?
Okay, so except for the middle part of that piece where you hear a little bit of Pablo Milanés accompanying himself on guitar and singing that song, all of those were sampled instruments, and the piece had a very ambiguous political context. I played it in Cuba in 1991, and everybody thought that was in support of the Comandante, who was actually not Fidel Castro, but Che Guevara. And but people in America, Cuban refugees, all felt that when the door slammed in that piece, boom, that was really putting Cuba to sleep. And how did I feel about it? Well, I felt just as ambiguous as the audience did, because I certainly admired Fidel Castro overthrowing the dictator Batista, but at the same time I recognized that he became a terrible dictator in a country and deprived them of many things. So it's hard to have a clear opinion of him, and I think the music is a nice way to express that ambiguity. I don't know. I don't really know. Okay, so it's 38. We have 20 more minutes. So I want to talk to you about your life in music and say some things about what I think you might face. Well, first of all, I think that musical culture is a bit, music stylistic culture is a bit circular. And so that styles tend to come back in certain ways, in modified form, and repeat themselves. But music seems so far to become shorter and shorter, that our brains are occupied by smaller and smaller bits ideas and memory. So most people don't sit and listen to a Bruckner symphony, or they want something that's fast and short, and that's not bad. I mean, there are a lot of fast and short pieces from the past as well. But people's attention span for music, I think, is shorter. And that's not a value judgment. That's just the way it is, you know. And my pieces were always shorter than most of the others that were on the same programs by other composers. Now, in my generation, of course, the computer was something quite new, and now it is ubiquitous. In fact, there is not a part, hardly a part of our musical culture unless you play an acoustic instrument like the violin or the guitar, acoustic guitar, that your life isn't touched by some form of computer music. But I don't like that term, computer music. In fact, that really bothers me. How can we, I mean, computer music, as opposed to what? String music? Well, but string music, when I hear the word string music, I conjure up sounds of strings or chords. I mean, chordophones. But computer could be anything. So that term doesn't seem to be very valid to me. And electronic music, I don't know. Electroacoustic music. That's not a bad term. I think that term's the best because it means that it's a music that's dependent on technology for its existence. And that again doesn't say anything about its style, and probably will have less and less to say. Now, I spent many years from 1973 until about 1989 both developing and then playing a digital synthesizer that I helped develop called the Synclavier. And at that time, one of my reasons for doing that was because I felt that electroacoustic music, you know, in those days you just heard it in an auditorium with two loudspeakers on the stage, and I thought, well, this would really be great if people could see how you made that music and play it. So I helped develop this instrument, and I played it for about 10 years on tour, taking it all over with me, and then the company went bankrupt and the instruments disappeared. So what happened to all that music? Well, I stole some of the ideas that I'd had in it and used it in other pieces. It was probably, you know, I mean, the music I composed for it, it was okay. It wasn't great. But it was a belief that we needed to have live electronic music, something today you have a little bit with laptop orchestras, except that these pieces were much more composed, and they were by one person. I guess there are laptop pieces that are composed by one person. I don't know with the degree of specificity that they might have, but I do believe the reason that, and everybody says, well, how come there are no great electronic instruments like the DX7 or something? Is that a great electronic instrument? Well, it's number one, because technology changes so rapidly. Number two, because nobody writes for them. I mean, a few people write. I wrote a lot of Synclavier pieces. Only a very few people ever played them. Yeah, they didn't have the instruments. And the technology gets better, but that's not so much it, because there are some older ones like the Theremin or the En Martineau that composers wrote for, and those pieces, although they're very marginal in our musical culture, they're still played. But until an instrument is widely adopted, like a violin or a trombone, it's just not going to be, you know, nobody's going to write for it. Composers don't want to write pieces that will then never be played again. I think that's true. So that's one of the reasons new instruments. But I am convinced that there will be new kinds of musical expression based on digital technology, and you will witness it, and you may not be able to even imagine what it will be now. It'll come out. I mean, then put yourself in the situation of those students of mine in 1967 who were listening to, who wrote on the future of music, right? And they said, what that's going to be like. I think we said, what will it be like in 2000? What will future music be like in the year 2000? Well, the year 2000 came and it sure didn't sound like that, and I don't think we'll be any more accurate about what it's going to be. Let's see. If I were to tell you where I think, I think that also that the concept of the virtuoso is something that seems embedded in our society, in all world cultures. Everybody, no matter whether they play African, Ethiopian, Iranian music, there are instruments and there are virtuosos, and those are virtuosi, and those are admired by the population. So I think that a musical culture has to have that element in it. People like to see someone else making music and to do it very well. But that also assumes that there is a wider cultural base of people in that tradition who can appreciate that virtuoso. I mean, you could say, well, I was a virtuoso on the synclavier, but who else knew how to work that thing? So they didn't know what I was doing. You know, I could have put the whole thing on tape and just pretended to play. They would never know because no one else had that experience. You have to have picked up a violin or a guitar and tried to play it. Then you'll know what a virtuoso is, right? And I think that's something people want in their musical culture. Then the other thing I would say is that just a minute. Oh yeah, one thing that I think will have the greatest impact on music in 50 years, or in the next 50 years, next half century, is the understanding of how the brain processes music and how to access that information. How do we store musical memories? How do we manipulate musical memories in our head? How do musical memories where you just have the memory of the music but it still can have that emotional impact on you? How do we understand that to be, and how can that be used in creative processes? I think that's going to develop. It's at a pretty primitive stage right now, but it is developing. And I mean, you know, through fMRIs, if you know what that is, where you can look at what's going on in the brain while people hear music, and you can see parts of it that light up and parts that don't. And we just don't happen to know what the mechanisms are for why different kinds of sounds, music, pitches, voices, why they are stored in so many multiple locations, and how the brain brings them together when we actually hear or reproduce a piece of music. So I think those are important things to know about and to watch out for, no matter what kind. Okay, so I've covered 80% of what I wanted to say, so I want to ask you in these remaining moments that we have, which is about 13 minutes and 2 seconds, what you might want to ask. Or have I? Yes, Elliot.
I just had a question. I remember we were talking and you mentioned that you lived outside of America for a couple of years.
A lot.
Yeah, and what was it like in terms of being a musician?
Well, I have two interesting stories for that. In 1973, I took a group of 12 students from Dartmouth College to the Kingdom of Tonga in the South Pacific. It's between Fiji and Samoa. And it has only an indigenous population. We were the first foreign students ever to be there. And they have a tradition. It only has 100,000 people and a king. And they have a tradition where everybody has to make their own songs. If you want to get married, if you're a man, you have to make up a song and sing it to the parents of your future in-laws, and sing a song to them that you made up. Well, of course, the musical language is pretty limited and largely influenced by Christian missionaries that came there a couple hundred years ago after Captain Cook. But the words in the poetry are all original, and that changed my idea, because here I was suddenly, well, we have a culture where we say, well, these people are professional musicians and these people are amateurs. And this is a culture where everybody is expected to participate in music. They sing in 8 parts. They don't have a written tradition for their music. It's all oral, and the melody is in the second from the top voice, and ornamentation on the top. And when they all sing together, whatever part is missing, the new person adds that part, knows what's missing and brings it in. that taught me an awful lot about oral tradition that I never would have known about. Another time, I ran for 3 years a project called the Micronesian Music Project. Micronesia is the area sort of between Guam, if you know where that is, in Japan, and Saipan, and Hawaii. It's all these small islands. They were battlegrounds in the Second World War. Truk, Ponape, Yap, Palau, Marshall Islands. And the idea there was that I had a friend who was a doctor there, American, and I discovered when going there that no one was listening to their own music. That was in the villages. But people, when they had cassette recorders, and they would listen to pop music from American from Armed Services Radio Network, because the U.S. was given these islands as a protectorate after the Second World War. And so they built roads and they put up a radio station. And the radio station's purpose was to warn them about bad weather coming, because otherwise they didn't know. So what are they going to do with the rest of the time? Well, they played music, pop music from America. And so then that's what the people, they got little portable, what we used to call transistor radios, and they got these little radios, and that's what they'd listen to. So my idea was, well, why don't we record their own music and broadcast it? And so we did that, but their own music, for a variety of cultural reasons. Number one, young people didn't want to know their old traditional music. They want to be modern. They want to be, and get out of there. They don't want the village hierarchy controlling their lives. They saw a taste of what it was outside, or they thought was wonderful here in Western culture, and so not many people listened to it. Then there was another thing I learned. There was this cultural taboo. They sing choirs. They sing in choirs. And it is forbidden to hear the voice of a dead person. So we recorded the choirs, but if one person died, then they couldn't broadcast the choir anymore. So that gives you an idea, answer your question a long way, of what I learned from being in other cultures about our music traditions. And it used to be, and still is in parts of the world, very different from what we know. But I would say that we are developing a world music culture which is disseminated through technology. Whether that's good or bad, again, I'm not going to say. It's just the way it is, So how that will change music, I don't know. Okay, another question, anyone? You had one.
Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to say on this topic, but I'm curious a little bit about your relationship with your composer peers, especially during really formative eras. And
Right.
Just to frame that a little bit, because it seems to me, you mentioned laptop orchestras and the rarity of a single person's vision
Right.
being put into that. And I see more and more willingness to collaborate and less of the individual composer who produces the work and then eventually gives
Right.
it to the musician.
So that,
And I hear maybe a superficial similarity, but a significant enough similarity between, say, your music of a certain period and Kenneth Gaboro or
Yes.
Tenney or something like that. So, anything that you could say about how you guys...
yeah, that's very
treat
interesting.
ideas and that
No one's ever mentioned my music, and I knew Ken. I love that piece of his, Lemon Drops.
Yeah.
And he was a very imaginative guy. And sure, in those days, back in those days, in the late 60s, early 70s, we all knew each other. There weren't so many of us there. So we all knew each other's music, and I would say admired each other's music, even though we were very different. I was at Columbia University in a class, that's where I learned electronic music, sort of. I was in a class with Vladimir Usachevsky, who was sort of the American pioneer of that. And in that class was Wendy Carlos, was Walter Carlos then, Charles Dodge, who I remained friends with for all my life. Who else? Emmanuel Gent, well, people don't know much about him. There were the musicologist Richard Taruskin. He was actually a composer in those days. And so we were all different ages. Jacob Druckmann was in that class. And so we all sort of knew each other and were encouraging each other. We felt we were on the frontier of something new and admired each other's approach to it. And the world seemed endless. There was so much to do. And I think sometimes today young composers feel inhibited by, well, that's already been done before. I can't do that. Well, you know, if you took that attitude, you'd be frozen in your. I knew all people. Some, you know, that doesn't have I answered it all.
Well, there is no answer, I guess. But I was curious just how closely you were working. And it sounds
We
like you
we
were
knew.
working.
Well, I did, and I made a great effort to make international contacts. So I was friends. I was probably who else? Jacob Druckmann from at that time, and me, probably were the only people close to the Groupe de Recherche Musicale in France. That was Pierre Schaeffer. Well, I knew Pierre Schaeffer. I met him. He was already much older then. But François Bayle, Guy Rebel, Bernard Parmigiani, and my lifelong friend Jean-Claude Risset, who I still see a couple times a year. And so, you know, I knew all of that tradition. It wasn't my tradition. And they thought that I was novel. They had this idea that Americans, just like Europeans used to have about Americans, I was kind of a rebel. I was sort of, they called me the French Satie. But my music isn't like Satie. But no, but it was, you know, it was quirky. I mean, I brought in all these radio commercials or whatever and did weird sounds and stuff. And I mean, weird recorded environments. And so, and in Sweden, I learned about text sound composition, which I think is one of the great art forms that's quite neglected, where it's a cross between music and poetry, and you speak it, and the very recitation of the music becomes the recitation of the poem, or where words become the music, and that's a very wonderful art form that was developed in Sweden.
Was that with Stan Hansen?
Stan, yes. How do you know that?
Oh, I know the sound poetry history.
Well, Stan is still alive. He's pretty sick. Bengt Emil Jonsson died 2 years ago, and my best friend Lars Gunnar Bodin, he just finished teaching a course at the Stiftelsen Elektronmusik Studio in Stockholm for young composers who are still interested in doing text sound compositions. There was a composer, he actually was in Britain, Henri Chopin, Bernhard Heitzig, and that was a big, powerful movement. I don't know why it isn't popular still, but it is a little in slam poetry, isn't it?
Well, you know, there's a revival that I think comes out of both a British and American kind of noise scene, where this has been rediscovered.
Yeah, I agree.
A lot of Chopin's works have been. Well, the whole collection of his audio magazine was.
Oh, Ooh. Yeah.
Was released by an Italian label. Well, 5 years.
That's very interesting that you know that. It warms my heart that these are things that have not been forgotten.
Yeah, well, and I think I'm starting to understand my question a little bit more as we're talking about it, in that for many people who just start hearing about figures, composers who are just individual figures.
They don't see the movements.
They don't see the casual interactions.
That's right. And what you point out, that's right. We do today. I'm very fond of Scarlatti. And all of a sudden I discovered the piano sonatas of Padre Antonio Soler. And they're very much like Scarlatti's, but they were quite separate traditions at the time. But now we hear them so much the same. And you can even, you know, Johann Christian Bach, you can hear some of that in Haydn. But at the time, I'm sure you couldn't. You know, they all sounded so different. But what you're pointing out is there's this historical perspective, and when you look back on it, you see, oh yeah, these guys must have all been influencing each other, and we were, but in a kind of unconscious way.
Right, you probably had just the milieu of the world.
That's right, and that's how that was the musical world we saw at the time. And your musical world is very different from the one I know. And that's great, good thing. I think we're out of time.
Sorry.
No, please. I was so thrilled that you know those things. And by the way, Henri Chopin is in no way related to Frédéric Chopin.
Well, I think
in the best way possible.
I think a couple other people had some. Max, you had your hand up. I don't want people to be...
Max, go ahead.
That's not important.
Yes, it is important.
Yeah, it is.
Come on, Max.
I was just wondering on your thoughts. I was wondering about your thoughts on this. like in the past, it used to be a lot more difficult to get in touch with other composers and a lot more difficult to hear a wide variety of music.
You bet.
But presently, there's almost, at times it seems like an information overload.
Yes, there is.
There's so much music out there that's so easily accessible. And I guess
Does that discouraging to you?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, Brahms, you know, we talk about Brahms because I know he's playing a piece of Brahms. But you know, he died. So there's only so much of Brahms. After you know it all, that's it. And there weren't too many people that wrote like Brahms. I don't know too many, but I'm not a music historian. Schumann a little bit maybe, but not too much. But anyway, today there is so much music, but and I listen to a fair amount, and not often by choice. Often I've been asked to, well, I mean, I do listen to tons of music. I have a friend who's a pianist at the New England Conservatory. He plays great Schubert and Chopin and stuff, and Beethoven. And he never listens to any music. And I listen to music constantly from all kinds of music. And it's sustaining. But sometimes I've judged these electronic music competitions or electroacoustic music, and where you have to listen to 100 pieces. And I must say that I listen to the first few minutes and then I go sample, and if I move in a ways, and if I don't like it, okay. Something has to capture my attention, and I probably am not fair to it. But I think that's how we are with all the music we hear today. I mean, I could probably find a little bit of Brahms for you that you'd say, just play a little snippet of it, and you say, I don't like that. Right? I mean, so it's unfair in the sense that we're not giving everybody a chance, but our attention span's short, and we have to be selective. And we don't have any other way to deal with this. Okay, anyone else?
All right. Well, let's thank Jon for coming.
Pleasure to be with
Thank
you.
so much.
Pleasure to be with you.